Our next speaker is Simon Levin, who is the James McDonald Distinguished University Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in Princeton. I'll keep the introduction short. You can look up the very long list of every possible society and every possible prize that Cy has. But I just want to say that he's the original hipster data scientist. Because he was a data scientist before data science was a thing, because his whole approach is really integrating between theoretical mathematical models and the data and experimental biology in understanding systems in ecology and as well as in human economies.
Thanks very much, Tanya. And it's great to be here for this birthday party for DIMACS, which has been a big influence on me since I've been at Princeton, and especially to thank Fred Roberts for, among others, but especially Fred for his incredible leadership. So, also I want to acknowledge the various funding sources. I won't take you through this, but thanks to all of them. I became an ecologist about 50 years ago when it was very much embedded in natural history. Natural history is the cradle of ecology, and it still remains the foundation. But in studying phenomena of this sort, this is the couple dynamics of the hare and the lynx, ecologists recognized that they had to build partnerships with other disciplines. So with mathematics initially, more recently with physics and chemistry and engineering, with genomics, and a little bit with the social sciences and humanities. But what I'm going to argue now is that a big future for theoretical ecology is building partnerships with economics and other social sciences. In ecology, mathematical approaches have a long history. First of all, in terms of basic studies, demography, life history theory and evolution, behavioral ecology, species interactions, and the dynamics of ecological communities, and a lot of the early work you may know went back to the great mathematician Vito Volterra, along with Alfred Lotka. But there's also been a rich literature on applications of ecological theory and the use of mathematics in areas like infectious diseases, the harvesting of fish species, the harvesting of forests, conservation biology, the design of reserves, bioeconomics and social systems, and more recently, one of the great challenges for us today is dealing with climate change, about which I'll say a little bit. So, for me, these problems highlight a number of challenges in systems theories, but especially as applied to ecological systems. First of all, what makes these systems robust and resilient, preventing critical changes that, for example, from oligotrophic lakes to eutrophic lakes, in the context of climate change, is climate change likely to be destabilizing ecosystems, reducing biodiversity? Secondly, how do we understand the patterns that emerge in these systems in terms of individual elements? How do we scale from the microscopic, in other words, from individual agents to macroscopic patterns? Malin Pinsky, who's on the faculty at Rutgers here, has been leading studies on range shifts in fish species. What is climate change going to mean for shifts in species distributions, and indeed for extinctions of species? And where I'm going to end, which I think is the great challenge, is how do we deal with problems of the commons? How do we deal with situations where we all have an interest in preserving our global environment, but none of us has enough individual incentive where we, without taking into account the collective good or some cooperative arrangements, what sorts of insurance arrangements can we achieve? How do we get to international agreements? So I want to start out with this fantastic video, it's not mine, of a bird flock. These are starlings over Rome. Well, they're almost all starlings. You ornithologists there may recognize one hawk that's in there that's driving much of this dynamics. And having been trained in fluid dynamics, when I looked at phenomena of this sort, I thought that looks a lot like a fluid. How do we scale from what individuals do to the collective. What are the implications of having these phenomena at multiple scales? So this is an example of what's been called a complex adaptive system, a system made up of a lot of individual agents that interact with each other locally, resulting in global patterns which have consequences for the individual agents and feedback. How do we scale from the individuals to the collective? And how do we deal with conflicts between the interests of the individuals and the interests of the collectives? So not only bird flocks and fish schools, but ecosystems and the biosphere are complex adaptive systems where individual agents and macroscopic patterns interacting with each other. And not only ecological systems, but obviously the socioeconomic systems that we're all part of and that the ecosystems are linked with are complex adaptive systems. So in systems of this sort, there is the potential for sudden transitions. Martin Schiffer, a book which came out a few years ago in the Princeton series, talked about critical transitions in nature and society with a particular focus on what are the factors that give rise to these sudden transitions? What can we learn from analogies with physics and other disciplines? Are there early warning signals? When you go to the doctor and the doctor takes an electrocardiogram, or if there's reason to take an electroencephalogram, what the doctor's looking for is early warning indicators that something more drastic is about to happen. I'll come back and talk a little bit about that, but that's an open problem. And there are likely tipping points in fisheries, but also maybe in the general circulation patterns of the oceans. These could be dramatic changes that are irreversible. An example of one critical transition that's taking place that is irreversible on any time scales that any of us can be aware of are the melting of the ice sheets, which is leading to sea level rise, and there's no way to reverse that. We're not going to refreeze the ice sheets. So how can we tell if these changes are taking place? What can we do to slow them down? Are there tipping points indeed in our own societies? I will say that I'm talking about tipping points as if they're bad. Most of the ones we're concerned with are, but there are other situations. For example, if the economy is in a recession, where one wants a tipping point, where one wants to take a system which is in a bad state and try to shift it to a new one. So there's a long history on this, and the question is, can we read the tea leaves? Are there early warning signals? This is a paper I happen to be part of, but that Martin Schiffer led, looking for signals of these impending changes. And a lot of the signals that people look for come from analogies with physics or with some of the work done 50 years ago by René Thom. It all goes back to this cartoon that you see on the right, which thinks about a system in terms of a ball on the landscape. You push the ball away, it comes back to rest in the bottom, and that's a stable equilibrium. But over time, it may be that the restorative capacity of the system is being eroded. That could be just that one's pushing the ball so far, it goes into some other valley, but it could be because of slow timescale changes that are changing the shape of the landscape, maybe coupled back to the fast scale dynamics, which would indicate that the rate of return to the equilibrium is less and would lead to what's called critical slowing down, associated with increasing variance like we see in the climate systems, increasing autocorrelation. When you get pushed away, you stay away, and maybe flickering between the state you're in and the state that you're likely to get pushed into. So there's been a lot of hype and a lot of excitement about these sorts of early warning signals. But one has to be aware that not all critical transitions show these early warning signals. These are characteristic in physics, essentially, of second order phase transitions. But if I'm pushing a ball along the table here and it's about to roll off the edge, there is no early warning signal. And so a number of people, notably Alan Hastings, Carl Boediger, and Noam Ross have written some perceptive papers pointing out the dangers of overgeneralizing. Actually, there's a history of overgeneralizing that goes back to catastrophe theory. When I first got into theoretical biology, more than 50 years ago, one of the papers that we all read was due to René Thom, and this was the book that he produced, in which he characterized the ways that systems could undergo sudden transitions when there was a slow timescale dynamics. It was beautiful theory, but it got oversold. Various papers appeared pointing out that this had been oversold, and the whole area basically collapsed, which I think was unfortunate. But it emphasizes one has to not only, when one sees that A implies B, one can't conclude that B, if one sees B, then A caused it. There may be multiple causes, and so one has to understand mechanisms. So that takes me to the second part of the talk, which is the challenge of scaling from the microscopic to the macroscopic. Everything from the bird flocks and the fish schools that I mentioned earlier to the sorts of patterns that you see in developmental biology, which inspired theoretical work by Alan Turing and lots of others since. How do these sorts of patterns emerge? Can we build microscopic models? Can we build lower dimensional models that will explain the patterns that one sees on animal coats or in nature or in the galaxies? If you're interested in sustainability, you're really interested in the macroscopic properties of the system. The American chestnut disappeared from forests around here, and yet the systems continued to function because chestnut oak and other species came in and took their place. If American chestnut was of interest to you, of course, that was a critical loss. But if you're interested in the sustainability of the system, not much changed. And so the focus of much work in conservation biology is on sustainability of whole systems. And that implies that what one has to do is to understand how those patterns emerge, patterns of nutrient cycling, for example, from the smaller scale interactions, but to recognize that not all the detail at the fine scale is important. If you wanted to understand how applying heat to a liquid would cause it to go through a transition, or how you could convert it into ice, or how you could apply pressure to do it, you develop a statistical mechanics that explains the macroscopic outcomes in terms of the microscopic behaviors, but tells you that you don't have to know what every molecule is doing. So that sort of approach has been followed in theoretical ecology for quite a while. My colleague Steve Pacala, following up on work of Dan Botkin, Hank Schugert, and others, led work which tried to model the dynamics of forests by growing individual trees according to certain rules, letting them shade each other out. This is an agent-based model about which you heard a bit yesterday. Send propagules out, and to grow forests like you see on the right. Now, what's predictable in that forest? Not where every tree is going to be, but the statistics of the distribution of individual species on a big enough area are predictable. It's a law of large numbers sort of phenomenon. So one has to take a step back and know what it is that makes this system sustainable. Indeed, if you move to the global scale, where these models have been linked with general circulation models, you don't even try to predict what every species is going to be doing. You're looking at species types, ecotypes. You want to know where there's going to be tundra, where there's going to be tropical forest, where there's going to be taiga. So you don't try to predict what every species is going to be. So as you abstract, you take steps back, one has to understand exactly what it is that is robust in these systems and what are the details that are replaceable. Another example that I don't have a slide about that I work on is the influenza virus. The influenza virus has been remarkably robust over millennia, even though individual strains come and go. In fact, because individual strains come and go, influenza is able to keep adapting. So robustness at the macro scale may not imply robustness at lower scales. In fact, it may depend upon a lack of robustness. at lower scales. The same sort of models have been developed, led by Mick Follows and others, for the oceans. This is what's called a standard nutrient phytoplankton zooplankton, NPZ model of the ocean. Lots of different species of nutrients, phytoplankton and zooplankton. You'll see the diffusion terms, the movement terms. You may not be able to see so clearly the other terms, but those are uptake terms, rates of uptakes of nutrient by phytoplankton, rates of consumption of phytoplankton by zooplankton. And you'll notice the fish aren't even in this model yet. And he and his colleagues have used this model to try to predict the global distribution of species, phytoplankton especially, and zooplankton in the oceans. And this is done remarkably well. But again, one doesn't predict exactly which species will be where. It's rather what are called ecotypes. Large eukaryotes, for example. And we and others have been developing models of this sort to try to describe the bird flocks that you saw before, the fish schools. This is from my colleague and former postdoc Ian Cousin on the left. And at the bottom, and I don't know, I know who gave me that slide, but I don't know where it's from. Those are reindeer. You can see the reindeer at the top are heading to the left. The ones at the bottom are heading to the right, just because they're following others. They'll eventually end up on the left, but they don't have much else to do anyway. So the question is, how can we explain these wonderful patterns? Lou was hoping I'd show a wildebeest slide here, but I didn't. Uh-oh. I did something bad, didn't I? And you did something good. Good. So now the question is, to what extent can one learn from bird flocks and fish schools about herd behavior in human societies? And there's a lot of work that's been done, for example, in voting theory and elsewhere on the dynamics of decision-making in human populations. And that's really where what I want to do in the last part of my lecture. So I've talked a bit about the classical advances. I've talked a bit about what increased computational ability has meant, for example, for modeling the bird flocks, fish schools, and global vegetation dynamics. And now I would like to talk about what I think are the prospects for the future, which is the interface with the social sciences and the humanities. How do we manage the local commons? How am I doing on time? Okay, good. So scientific consensus is strong on many core environmental issues in terms of rising global temperatures, but we haven't taken adequate actions to address them. And the limitations are not that we don't know the physics and the chemistry and the biology, although there's more to learn there, but it has to do with the willingness of people to commit to the common good and to cooperate in finding solutions that benefit everyone. This is a survey of about now 20 years ago that Resources for the Future carried out on attitudes towards climate change in Sweden, China, and the US. The remarkable thing is that in Sweden and China, everybody was convinced, 95% anyway, that climate change was a problem and we had to address it. But in the US, the numbers were much smaller, about 75%. If you look at more recent studies, this coming out of Yale, you see an interesting trend. In 2018, 41% of the people, as you can see up there, were alarmed or concerned that climate change was a problem. In 2010, I'm sorry, 51%, I can do the math, 51%. In 2010, it's 39%. What happened there? Well, there was a financial crisis, and people said, we'll worry about climate change later. We got more important problems. We need economic growth. And now, 10 years later, those numbers are back up almost to where they were before. And in fact, I have another slide, which I won't show, that shows that this trend is continuing, and we're back to about where we were in 2018. Nearly half of Americans are sure global warming is happening. Those are Democrats and Republicans, though. So you can see the numbers are quite different. The central issues are ones of behavior and culture. How do we deal, as we heard in the last talk, where there was the collective good and the individual good, with intergenerational and intragenerational equity, dealing with public goods? How do we get cooperation in the commons? What's the role of social norms and institutions? Foot binding is one of the classic examples of a social norm that was stabilized over long periods of time and then suddenly disappeared. But we have other examples of smoking in public, of gender equality attitudes, racial equality, flying of the Confederate flag in South Carolina, where the change suddenly occurs overnight. How can we understand that? We've been particularly interested in this in terms of decarbonization, and hopefully I'll have a minute to say a word about that at the end. Public goods problems are widespread, of course, in socioeconomic context, these fishermen in conflict with each other and with the oil rigs, but also tumor growth. The tumor cells grow. That's an example of the breakdown of the commons. That's ultimately not good for the collective, but they gain an advantage internally. The idea of the commons was introduced by William Forster Lloyd 2 centuries ago. It was picked up by Garrett Hardin, who talked about the tragedy of the commons, and he argued that the solution to this problem was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. But he largely meant a large role for government, and it was left to my late colleague, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize and didn't share it. No, she was a wonderful, wonderful person who showed that that small societies could solve the problem of cooperation from the bottom up. They didn't need a big role for government. Building on her ideas, two former students and postdocs of mine worked with me on the problem of how do we regulate the removal, say, of fish from a common pool or water from a common aquifer. The idea being, if it were mine alone, I would withdraw at a conservative rate to leave stuff for the future. But if it's open access, I have less incentive to do that. So how do we, and I'm not gonna have time to talk about this model in detail, but how do we get cooperative arrangements through the formation of consortia which agree to withdraw at lower levels and agree to punish individuals through ostracism who withdraw at a higher level? So this is the model we developed, in which there's a payoff use of C to cooperators and a payoff to defectors, which is higher, pi sub D, but the defectors lose out because they're being, they're being punished by the cooperators. F sub C is the frequency of the cooperators, and omega is how the punishment function depends on it. So the idea is, and what the model shows, is if you can get the number of cooperators above a certain level, you can regulate the commons. There's a lot more to it. But the notion of a threshold number of cooperators also finds its way into international agreements, where you don't put an international agreement into effect unless you have a threshold number of countries who have agreed to participate. So this is a coordination game for the game theorist rather than a prisoner's dilemma type of game, where there are multiple equilibria, and the question is, how do you get from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium? In terms of decarbonization, Vitor Vasconcelos has been my postdoc for a while, and together with Elke Weber, a wonderful psychologist at Princeton, we've been charged as part of a big project with trying to understand how one can implement decarbonization. The focus of this study is in India. How do you get people to accept it? How do you get governments and countries to accept it? So we're building a model in which individuals have attitudes towards certain issues. They belong to certain groups, and they change their opinions based on who else is in their group, et cetera, and they may change their groups. These groups are overlapping. No time to talk about this in detail, but much of the inspiration comes from one of Lynn Ostrom's latest papers, final papers, in which she argued one needed what was called a polycentric approach, where you build local cooperation, and then those created building blocks, rather than trying to get 200 countries to agree all at once. So this has led Avinash Dixit, a great game theorist, and my student Andrew Tillman and me to look at the dynamics of investments in a collective good in a structured population where individuals take into account their own interest, the collective interest, how much feeds back to them, and some degree of prosociality, caring for others. Prosociality is important, and you might ask, why is it there? Avinash and I wrote a paper which showed that you could actually build in prosociality through a tax that got individuals to contribute to the education of their children, because other work shows that in a highly cooperative society, you're better off, and therefore you want your children in a better society. So again, this coordination game in which one can show that, that people will contribute to a collective good for the benefit of their children. And finally, with Vitor and Philip Hanneman, George Pacheco, we've been working on climate change agreements at the global level that have a similar structure. Individual nations belong to groups, but those groups are overlapping. NATO, the UN, the World Health Organization, et cetera. And that overlapping of membership turns out to be important to the development of collective dynamics. So lots of interest, lots of problems, especially in game theory here. So let me conclude. Ecosystems and socioeconomic systems are complex adaptive systems made up of individual agents, and that raises a number of challenges, I think, for theoretical ecology still in the next century. How do we develop a statistical mechanics of ecological communities and the socioeconomic systems they're coupled with? Can we understand the emergence of pattern on multiple scales? Can we develop indicators that are reliable of impending critical transitions? And finally, how do we find pathways to governance in the multi-scale commons? Thanks very much.
Thank you, and you got us a little bit back on time as well. So we have time for a couple of questions.
Fred.
So I think with respect to game theory, it could be that some of the traditional phenomena in Morgenstern cooperative games might be a relevant model. So
Is that relevant or irrelevant?
Irrelevant. So I think back to, you talk about Nobel Prize winners. My former colleague, Lloyd Shapley, together with Martin Shubik at Yale, developed a number of relatively simple but interesting discussion purpose games, like the garbage game, where everybody has a bag of garbage and you're required to dump it on somebody else's backyard. And did some, so for talking purposes, that was a very interesting example where coalition formation was part of the solution. So I guess what I'm asking is whether simple games might be a model for at least discussion and development of concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another game of Shubik's that I play with my class is the one where the top two bidders for a prize both have to pay. These are all very instructive, and so I'm a great believer in simple games to start with, and then building up from there. Yes.
Any other questions? Okay.
This is sort of a tongue-in-cheek one, but is there any model that can be used to predict what's going on with our current president and climate change, and what I see as some very, you were talking about, things that can have, effect later on. Or is this too much of a complex issue?
Well, it is a complex issue, but I think, as you will recognize, what's going on with our current president is not going on with our current president alone. I've been running a series of working groups called Dialogues and Complexity, and the topic we've chosen for this year is the dynamics of political polarization. And I mean, I really think that to understand what's going on, one has to understand how societies get polarized. There are two dimensions, two aspects of that. I'm going to save the word dimensions for a few seconds. One of them is the degree to which clusters of opinions arise. If you look, for example, at politics in some other countries like Israel, you'll see a lot of different pockets of things. But the other is why our societies become reduced dimensionally. You know, we care about a lot of different issues, but in effect, in the U.S., we've reduced things almost to a one-dimensional. I don't even know if it's a continuum where one has pockets at the two extremes. And I've experienced this also academically, in the sense that if you have an opinion that differs from that of your group, it's very difficult. You can get ostracized for the group. I didn't talk much, but that's a critical part of the decarbonization thing, where you belong to groups have attitudes and opinions, and those attitudes and opinions get enforced, and that tends to reduce the dimensionality of the system. There are reasons you want to be in the group. It increases your power. So we're trying to understand that, and I really think to understand what's going on in the White House, one has to understand what's going on in terms of political polarization in our societies. There was an interesting article in this morning's New York Times by David Brooks about populism, how it became a global movement, and how he argues there's pushback against it now. But I think one has to understand the trends in society. I'm not going to say the other thing I was going to say because it might be a little too controversial. I'll say some of it. Is that in early 2016, I happened to be in Munich, and I went to Dachau, where there was exhibits of what was going on in Germany in the early 1930s, before Hitler rose to power. And I thought, that was scary, and we see trends of it here, and that was before the election. So I think you have to understand it in terms of trends within societies.
On that happy note.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon.